Some encounters don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning or ceremony. They slip through the noise of an ordinary night like smoke under a closed door. Quiet, inevitable, and impossible to ignore once you've breathed them in. She wasn't looking for him. He wasn't supposed to exist in her world. But the universe has always had a cruel sense of humor, and the night she walked into that club was the night everything she thought she controlled began to unravel. One stranger. One night. One moment that would rewrite the entire map of her life. Because some men don't just enter your orbit. They become the gravity you can't escape. This is their story. If it moves you, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's begin. The night was the kind that made Milan feel alive and dangerous all at once. Ariana Greco stood at the entrance of Oscuro, the city's most whispered-about private club, and felt the bass vibrate through the soles of her heels before she even stepped inside. The line wrapped around the block, but she wasn't in the line. Her colleague Bianca had secured passes through someone who knew someone, and now here they were, being waved past the velvet rope by a man the size of a small building who didn't smile at anyone. "Don't overthink it," Bianca said, looping her arm through Ariana's. "One night. No spreadsheets. No alarm set for 5 a.m. Ariana laughed, though it came out thinner than she intended. "I don't overthink things." Bianca gave her a look that said everything without saying a word. Fine. She overthought everything. But she had reasons. Starting a new job in 48 hours, after 6 months of freelancing in the hollow aftermath of her last position ending badly. Badly being a polished word for what her former boss had done, was enough to keep anyone in their head. But Bianca was right. Tonight was supposed to be something else. She stepped inside. The club was dark in the way of expensive things. Intentional, curated. The kind of darkness that made everyone look like art. Low amber lighting pooled over marble floors. Somewhere above, a DJ moved between beats with a surgeon's precision, and the crowd moved with him, bodies close and slow. The air smelled of aged whiskey and expensive perfume, and something else she couldn't name. Something electric. Bianca pulled her toward the bar. They ordered drinks Ariana couldn't pronounce, and she sipped hers carefully, watching the room the way she watched everything. Cataloging, measuring, keeping a quiet distance between herself and the chaos. That was when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a movement. Just pressure. The specific weight of being watched by someone who wasn't bothering to hide it. She turned. He was standing at the far edge of the upper mezzanine, one hand resting on the railing, a glass held loosely at his side. Dark suit. No tie. The top button of his shirt undone like an afterthought. He wasn't dancing, wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't performing the way every other man in this room was performing. He was simply watching her. And when her eyes found his, he didn't look away. Most men looked away. It was a reflex, the social contract of getting caught staring. But this man held her gaze with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who had never once been made to feel self-conscious about anything he wanted. Ariana looked away first. "There's a man staring at me," she said to Bianca. Bianca turned with the subtlety of a car alarm. "Where? Oh." A pause. "Oh, Ari. Don't. I'm not doing anything. Your face is doing something." "My face is simply acknowledging that the man standing on that mezzanine looking at you like you're the only person in this entire building is." Bianca paused for effect. "Obscenely attractive." Ariana took a long sip of her drink. She did not look back up. She lasted approximately 4 minutes. When she looked again, he was gone. The relief and the disappointment arrived at the same moment, tangled so tightly together she couldn't separate them, which was its own kind of answer she didn't want to examine. Bianca dragged her to the dance floor after that, and Ariana let herself be dragged. She moved with the music and let the bass do what a glass of wine at home couldn't. Quieted the noise in her head, the running list of tomorrow's worries and last year's wounds. For a few songs, she was just a woman in a dark club, moving, alive, untethered. Then a hand touched her waist. Not Bianca's hand. Different. Larger. And placed with a deliberateness that was nothing like an accident. She turned. He was taller up close. That was the first thing. The second was his eyes, dark, a shade between brown and black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was a stillness to his face that shouldn't have been attractive, shouldn't have pulled at her the way it did. But it did. It absolutely did. "You were watching me," she said, because she had never been good at pretending. "I was." His voice was low, accented, Italian, she thought, though refined in the way of someone who'd spent years letting other languages smooth the edges. "You were watching the room like you were looking for something." I wasn't. Or like you were hoping something would find you. A pause. He didn't smile, not quite, but something moved at the corner of his mouth. I thought I'd introduce myself. He told her his name. Raphael. Just Raphael. No last name offered. She didn't ask. He asked if she wanted a drink, and she said she had one, and he said the bar upstairs was quieter, and she said she was fine here, and somehow. She still wasn't entirely sure how. 30 minutes later, she was sitting across from him in a curved leather booth on the mezzanine level, her half-finished drink between them, talking. Not flirting. Talking. That was the thing she didn't expect. The way he listened. Not the performative listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but real attention. The kind that made her feel slightly exposed, like he was reading between every sentence she said for the one she meant. She told him she was starting a new job. She didn't say in what. He didn't press. He told her he traveled often, that he found most cities interesting for about 72 hours before the novelty wore off. She asked which ones had lasted longer. He thought about it seriously, like the question deserved a serious answer, and said, 2. Tokyo. And wherever I happen to be right now. She told herself that was a line. It landed anyway. The club shifted around them, hours collapsing into themselves the way they do when the conversation is good and the low light is kind, and the music is just far enough away to be atmosphere rather than intrusion. At some point Bianca appeared at the edge of the booth, took one look at the two of them, mimed an explosion with her hands, and disappeared again. Ariana would deal with that later. You're not from here originally, he said. It wasn't a question. Tuscany, she said. Small town. You would never have heard of it. Try me. She told him the name of her village. He was quiet for a moment and then said perfectly, There's a restaurant there. Old place. The owner is a woman in her 70s who makes the pasta herself every morning and refuses to write down the recipe. Ariana stared at him. You've been there. Once. 4 years ago. I remember the food, and I remember the light in the morning. He looked at her across the rim of his glass. I didn't know I'd remember it this clearly until right now. She should have been careful at that. Should have cataloged it as charm, technique, the polished arsenal of a man who was clearly very good at this. Instead, she felt something loosen in her chest, some tight wound thing she'd been carrying for months, and she made a decision she'd examine in daylight, but not tonight. Tonight was for this. Later, much later, when the club had thinned and the music had softened, they stood outside on a small private terrace that overlooked a canal, the night air cool and sharp after hours of warmth inside. The city was quiet in the way Milan got quiet past 2 a.m., which wasn't truly quiet, but was a different kind of noise. More honest. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her. The amber light from inside fell across one side of his face and left the other in shadow. What kind of true? The kind you don't usually say. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd deflect. Then, I'm tired of rooms where everyone wants something from me before I've finished saying hello. His voice was level, unhurried, like he was reporting rather than confessing. Tonight was the first time in a long time I sat across from someone and couldn't tell what they wanted. Maybe I wanted something. Maybe. He studied her. But it didn't feel like that. She looked out at the canal. I wanted one night where I wasn't the version of myself who's scared about what comes next. And she turned to look at him. Still working on it. Something crossed his face then. Not quite a smile, something quieter and more dangerous than a smile. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair away from her face. The touch so brief and deliberate it felt like punctuation. Like a sentence completed. You don't have to figure out what comes next tonight, he said. She didn't. The terrace. The canal. The conversation that stretched until the sky at the edge of the city began its first pale suggestion of dawn. She wouldn't remember every word later, but she would remember the feeling. The specific, rare quality of feeling seen by a stranger in the middle of the night when both of you have agreed wordlessly to be honest. When she finally said she needed to leave, he walked her down to the entrance where Bianca was waiting, sleepy and smug. He didn't ask for her number. She didn't offer it. There was something almost respectful in that. The way neither of them reached out to extend the moment beyond what it had been. One night. Complete in itself. He said her name once, the way it sounded in an Italian mouth, and then he was gone back into the building, and she was stepping into the cool early morning, Bianca's arm around her shoulders, and she thought, that is a man I will never see again. She was wrong. 48 hours later, Ariana Greco walked into the Milan headquarters of Santini Group. one of Europe's most prominent private investment and development conglomerates. Clutching a portfolio she'd revised 4 times, and wearing the blazer that always made her feel like she'd borrowed someone else's confidence. The offices were on the 12th floor of a building that smelled of polished stone and serious money. The receptionist was efficient and kind. HR processed her paperwork with practiced warmth. She was given a badge, a desk assignment, an orientation packet, and a schedule for her first week. And then she was told that the executive team had a brief welcome orientation for all new senior hires. The conference room was glass-walled and looked out over the city. A few other new employees filtered in, all of them wearing versions of the same careful, composed expression she suspected she was also wearing. She found a seat toward the middle of the long table and opened her portfolio to something, anything, just to have something to look at. The door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She heard movement, the shift in the room's energy, the way conversations stilled and postures corrected themselves the way they do in the presence of authority. She'd been in enough corporate spaces to recognize the specific atmospheric change that came with someone important entering a room. She looked up. The man who walked in was in a charcoal suit, his dark eyes moving across the room with the calm, systematic attention of someone accustomed to reading spaces quickly. He moved to the head of the table. He set down a leather portfolio without glancing at it. He looked at the assembled group. His gaze found hers. The world did something strange. A kind of held-breath stillness that lasted less than a second and felt like falling. Don Rafael Santini. Founder. CEO. The name on the building. The man from the terrace. He didn't react. That was the extraordinary thing. His expression didn't shift, didn't flicker, didn't betray a single thing. He looked at her the way he looked at the rest of the room, with calm, professional attention. Then he began to speak. His voice was the same. Low, measured, accented. It moved through the conference room with ease, speaking about the company's values, its culture, the expectations he held for everyone who worked within the organization. She heard perhaps 30% of the words. The rest were swallowed by the static in her own head. He knew. He had to know. He'd heard her name in orientation paperwork, had probably known before she walked through the door this morning. He had known for 48 hours, which meant he'd stood on that terrace with her and said all the things he'd said, and she stopped that thought before it could finish. When the orientation ended and people began standing, gathering their things, she stayed seated for exactly 4 additional seconds. A breath, a reset, and then she stood and moved toward the door with everyone else. Ms. Greco. His voice, her name, and the room suddenly had far fewer people in it than it had a moment ago, because the others were already filtering out, and she was standing near the doorway, and he was at the head of the table, and there was nothing between them but 12 feet of polished conference table and the full, absurd weight of 2 nights ago. She turned. Mr. Santini. He studied her. Whatever was happening behind those dark eyes, she couldn't read it. Welcome to the company. Thank you. A pause. Measured. Deliberate. My assistant will send you the onboarding materials specific to your division. I trust the transition has been straightforward so far. Perfectly straightforward, she said. Her voice was steady. She was professionally proud of that. Good. He picked up his portfolio. My door is available to all senior staff. If questions arise regarding the structure or scope of your role, don't hesitate. And then he walked past her, out the door, and down the corridor, and was gone. Ariana stood in the empty conference room for another moment. Then she walked to her new desk, sat down, opened her laptop, and stared at the screen without seeing it. One night, complete in itself. Except it was not apparently complete. It was apparently the beginning of something she had no framework for and no idea how to navigate. She opened her email. She started working. That was all she could do. The first week at Santini Group was both harder and easier than she expected. Harder because the work was genuinely complex. She'd been hired as a senior analyst in the acquisitions division, and the portfolio she'd inherited was dense with projects in various stages of development across 3 countries. Easier because the work was the kind she was good at, the kind that consumed her completely when she let it, and throwing herself into the complexity of it was an effective strategy for not thinking about other things. She saw Rafael Santini twice that first week. Once in the elevator, where he was flanked by 2 members of the legal team and speaking in rapid Italian that she understood well enough to know it was something about a Brussels filing. He nodded at her when she stepped in. She nodded back. They rode 4 floors in silence that lasted roughly the same duration as a minor geological event. Once in the corridor outside the executive suite, where he was on the phone, walking and speaking with that focused, unhurried authority, and he glanced at her as she passed and said nothing because he was on the phone, and she said nothing because what was there to say. By Friday, she had almost convinced herself it was manageable. A blip, an awkward coincidence in an otherwise professional context, and they were both adults who had done nothing wrong, and everything would settle into its appropriate shape. And then Marco Ferretti appeared. Marco was in business development, handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way of someone who'd always been handsome and had never once found it a burden. He stopped by her desk on Friday afternoon with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no about anything casual. "You're the new analyst Rossi brought on?" he said, leaning against her desk partition. "Senior analyst," she said, without looking up from her screen. Right. He wasn't deterred. "A group of us are going to Alfredo's tonight. Drinks. The informal kind of team bonding that HR can't make mandatory. You should come." She looked up then. He was smiling, the kind of smile that knew it was working. She'd seen that smile before, in various configurations, on various faces. "Maybe," she said. He took maybe as yes, left her his number, and walked away with the particular gait of a man already composing the story he'd tell about this later. She watched him go and thought neutrally, he is harmless. He is probably harmless. She went to Alfredo's. It was good, actually. Her colleagues were warm and funny in the particular way of people bonded by shared workplace stress, and by 9 p.m. she was on her second Aperol spritz and laughing at something the woman from the legal department was saying about a contract that had arrived in a language no one in the office officially spoke. Marco sat next to her. She didn't stop him. He was charming in person, easy to talk to, didn't push in the ways she'd been braced for. They talked about the company, about Milan, about a film they'd both apparently seen at the same festival the previous autumn. It was light and pleasant, and she felt, for the first time since walking into that building, something close to normal. She didn't think about Raphael Santini once. Until she saw him. He was at the far end of the bar, which was the kind of coincidence that stopped feeling like coincidence. He was with 2 other men, business, she assumed from the body language, and he was not looking at her. But something told her he had looked. She picked up her drink. Marco said something amusing and she laughed, and she was not looking at the far end of the bar, and everything was fine, except her skin was doing something irritating that she refused to acknowledge. When she glanced over 20 minutes later, he was gone. The following Monday, she arrived to find a meeting request from Raphael Santini's office. Not from his assistant. From him. Subject: Q3 Brussels filing, analyst input required. 9 a.m. His office. She went. His office was the corner suite. Of course it was, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the city and the kind of sparse, deliberate order that spoke not of emptiness but of control. Everything in its place. Nothing unnecessary. A desk that probably cost more than her first car, and a sitting area near the windows where he was standing when she arrived, looking at something on his phone. He gestured to the chairs near his desk without looking up. "Sit." She sat. He put down his phone and looked at her then, and she met his gaze with the precise amount of professional composure that had cost her approximately the entire weekend to assemble. "The Brussels acquisition," he said. "Rossi tells me you reviewed the preliminary file." "I did. Your assessment." She opened her portfolio. She had prepared for this, had stayed late Thursday evening going through the file with the thoroughness she brought to everything that mattered to her professionally. She walked him through her analysis, the structural concerns in the holding agreement, the timing risk in the regulatory review window, a comparative note on a similar acquisition from 3 years ago that had stalled for related reasons. He listened without interrupting. That same quality of attention she'd felt on the mezzanine, now directed at quarterly filings instead of a canal at 2 a.m. equally effective. More alarming, somehow, in this context. When she finished, there was a pause. "The 2021 comparison," he said. "You pulled that yourself? It wasn't in the file you sent. I found it in the archive." He was quiet for a moment that she couldn't read. Rossi's team missed it. They may not have looked at the 2021 portfolio. Different division. You're in acquisitions, not cross-division records. I was curious. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite approval, something quieter that landed harder than either. "The filing proceeds with your structural note as a condition precedent." I'll have the legal team work from your framework. She nodded. Is that all? For now. She stood, closed her portfolio, and was 3 steps toward the door when he spoke again. Ariana. Her name. First name. Not Ms. Greco. She stopped. Turned. He was looking at her directly, and for the first time since that conference room, the professional distance had shifted slightly. Not disappeared, but tilted a degree, enough for something underneath to become visible. You're good at this, he said. Don't minimize that. She held his gaze for 1 breath. 2. I never do. She walked out. The elevator ride down was 12 floors of her heart, doing something she refused to medically categorize. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that she only recognized in retrospect. She would arrive to find a problem on her desk. Not a manufactured problem. Never anything beneath the genuine complexity of the work they actually did, but problems that happened to sit at the intersection of her specific skills and his interests. She would solve them. Occasionally they'd meet to discuss. He would listen with that absolute attention, and then do something. Implement her analysis, advocate for her position in a meeting she wasn't in, send a brief, precise email that amounted to public professional acknowledgement within the organization. Small things. Deliberate things. She noticed them the way you notice a pattern in a fabric. 1 line means nothing, 2 lines might be coincidence, 3 lines is a design. She didn't address it directly. She told herself there was nothing to address. He was her employer. He was an exacting professional who worked closely with the people he trusted to execute well. This was normal. This was how capable executives operated. She was almost convincing. Marco, meanwhile, had graduated from casual invitations to something that required more active navigation. He brought her coffee twice without asking. He stopped by her desk with a frequency that had begun to generate its own low-grade comment among her colleagues, the teasing, speculative kind. She handled it with the precise combination of warmth and detachment she'd developed over years of managing this exact dynamic. On a Thursday afternoon, he appeared at her desk with 2 coffees and a smile that had clearly rehearsed itself. Dinner, he said. Not drinks. Actual dinner. There's a place in Navigli that's impossible to get into without knowing someone. And I know someone. She looked at him. Marco. Don't say maybe again. Maybe is how people end up nowhere. She almost smiled. That's surprisingly philosophical. I have depths. He set her coffee down. Say yes. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was seriously considering it, but because she was deciding how to be honest without being unkind. Marco was harmless. Marco was also not the problem. The problem was the reason she was hesitating, which was a reason she absolutely refused to examine. I don't think so, she said. But thank you. I mean that. He took it with grace, she'd give him that. He picked up his coffee, saluted her with it, and walked away. Across the open-plan floor, from the corridor that led to the executive suite, she had the sudden, prickling certainty of being watched. She looked. The corridor was empty. She turned back to her screen. That evening, as she was the last of her team still at her desk, she pulled up the quarterly report she'd been annotating and found a single comment left in the margin of the shared document. Not from her supervisor, not from the legal team. From Arsantini. It said, asterisk good catch on section 4.2. This matters, asterisk. 3 words per sentence. Maximum economy. And yet she read it twice. She closed the laptop and went home and made dinner and told herself she was a professional woman with a serious career, and she was not going to be undone by margin comments from a man she had sat with on a terrace once, 2 weeks ago, in what felt now like a different life. Then she sat on her apartment balcony with a glass of wine and stared at the lights of the city and admitted, to herself alone in the honest dark. She thought about him every day. Not the boss. Not the authority. The man on the terrace who was tired of rooms where everyone wanted something. The man who'd remembered a restaurant in her village. The man who'd held her gaze across a crowded club like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. She was in trouble. Not the career kind. Worse. The following week, everything shifted. It started in a Friday meeting. The full acquisitions and development team. 12 people around the table, Raphael at the head. They were reviewing a potential acquisition in Florence, a mid-sized development property with complex heritage restrictions that made the legal timeline thorny. Ariana had prepared. She'd done what she always did, gone deeper than the brief required, found the structural detail that everyone else had glossed over, arrived ready. She was presenting her section when Marco, from across the table, interrupted. The heritage restriction timeline Ariana flagged is solid, he said, in the manner of someone summarizing someone else's work for the benefit of the room. I pulled a comparison from the Naples project. The Naples comparison doesn't apply, Ariana said. Not sharply, calmly, but clearly. Marco blinked. The regulatory structure is similar. The regulatory structure is similar, but the asset classification is different. Naples was commercial. This property is listed residential heritage. Different ministry, different approval cycle, longer exposure window. She looked at the room. I laid this out in section 3 of the brief that went out Tuesday. A pause. Then Raphael, from the head of the table, without inflection. Section 3 is correct. Continue, Ariana. She continued. But she felt the room's attention recalibrate. That subtle, collective shift when people decide someone is to be taken seriously. And she felt, more specifically, the weight of Raphael's gaze at the head of the table, which didn't leave her for the remainder of the presentation. Afterward, as people filed out, he stopped her with a word. Your analysis on the approval cycle, he said. I want it expanded for the board deck. Full treatment. When do you need it? Monday. It was Friday afternoon. I'll have it Sunday night. He looked at her for a moment. You don't need to work the weekend. I know. She held his gaze. I want to. Something shifted in his expression. That quiet thing again, the thing that felt like recognition, like two frequencies briefly aligning. He nodded once and stepped back, and she walked out past the glass wall and into the corridor and breathed. That Sunday evening, working at her kitchen table with the balcony door open to the cooling air, she received an email. From R. Santini. At 8:47 p.m. On a Sunday. Asterisk if you're working on the Florence deck. The 2018 Florence Heritage Registry update is in the archive under Cultural Assets, not Real Estate. Saves time, asterisk. She sat with her laptop for a moment. Then she typed back, asterisk found it. Thank you, asterisk. 3 minutes later. Asterisk the Naples comparison was a reasonable attempt. He'll get there, asterisk. She almost laughed, surprised by it, by the dryness of it, by how well she remembered his humor from the terrace. She typed, asterisk I know. He's not wrong, just imprecise, asterisk. A pause. Then, imprecision costs more than people think. She looked at that sentence on her screen for a long moment, because she had the unshakable feeling they were no longer talking about Marco or Naples. She typed, I know. She sent it. No response came. She worked until 11 and then she went to bed, and she lay in the dark with the city quiet outside her window and she thought, this is the edge. The place where the professional and the personal are pressed so close together you can feel both heartbeats at once. She thought, I should step back. She thought, I don't want to. She didn't sleep well. She dreamed of a terrace over a canal and a voice saying her name in the dark, and she woke at 5 a.m. with her heart going faster than it had any right to for someone who'd done nothing but work and dream. Monday arrived. She submitted the Florence deck at 7:50 a.m. She arrived at the office at 8:30. She went to her desk, opened her email, and found a response from Raphael's office with a single line. Asterisk this is the best analysis I've received on a heritage asset in 3 years. Well done, asterisk. And beneath it, 4 words in a separate line that had nothing to do with Florence and everything to do with everything else. We need to talk. She read those 4 words and felt them land somewhere below her sternum, in the place where all the things she'd been carefully not feeling had apparently been accumulating for weeks. Her phone buzzed. A calendar invite, asterisk R, Santini/A, Greco, private meeting. Tuesday, 7 p.m. Not the office, asterisk. She stared at the address in the invite. Not the building. Not the conference room. A restaurant. Private. He wasn't pretending this was about Florence. And she wasn't pretending she didn't know what it meant. She accepted the invite. She put her phone face down on her desk. And across the office, somewhere behind the glass walls of the executive suite, she knew, without seeing, without proof, that Raphael Santini was doing exactly what she was doing. Trying to decide if what came next was a beginning or a mistake. And knowing, the way you know certain things in the deep and honest part of yourself that logic doesn't reach. It was already neither. It was already inevitable. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't advertise itself. No sign above the door. No entry on any of the apps that curated Milan's dining scene for people who liked their decisions made for them. Just a narrow door on a quiet street in the Brera district, and a man inside who nodded at Raphael like he'd been expecting him and led them both to a private room in the back where the walls were warm terracotta and the table was set for two and everything felt, deliberately and without apology, like a conversation that had been waiting to happen. Ariana sat across from him and thought, I should have worn something different. Then she thought, I shouldn't be thinking about what I'm wearing. Then she thought, I'm definitely in trouble. You know what this is, she said before the menus arrived. He looked at her. I do. I work for you. You do. That is, she paused, searched for a word that was accurate without being dramatic, a significant complication. It is. He was very still. Not the stillness of avoidance. The stillness of a man who had already thought through every version of this conversation and was prepared to be honest in all of them. I've thought about it. And I don't have a clean answer, he said. I thought I should tell you that rather than arriving here with a solution that pretends the complication doesn't exist. She looked at him across the table. The candlelight was doing things to his face that she catalogued and then firmly filed away. What do you want from this conversation? To be honest with you. A pause. I was honest with you on a terrace 3 weeks ago, and it felt like something I hadn't done in a long time. I'd like to do it again. She folded her hands on the table. Then I'll be honest too. I think about what you said that night more than I should, given where I work and who you are. I think it's unprofessional, and I've tried to stop, and I haven't stopped, and I'm telling you that because you said honesty. He held her gaze. I requested you for every brief I could reasonably justify. I know. That's also unprofessional. I know. I found every professional reason to be in your orbit, he said. And I'm aware that was deliberate, and I want you to have the complete picture before you decide anything. She was quiet for a moment. What am I deciding? Whether to walk away from this dinner and keep everything exactly as it is. You have a career here that is yours entirely. Nothing you've achieved has anything to do with me beyond the initial hire, and the initial hire was based purely on your file. His voice was level. If you walk away from this table, nothing changes professionally. I will not make it difficult. And if I don't walk away? The candle between them was very still. Outside, somewhere on the quiet street, a moped passed. The restaurant breathed around them. Then we figure out what this is, he said. Carefully. Honestly. Without pretending the complications don't exist. She studied him. This man who occupied an entire building, who moved through every room like he was comfortable with the weight of being himself, who had stood on a mezzanine in a dark club and watched her without apology, who left margin comments on Sunday evenings and remembered restaurants in her village, and had told her, in the middle of the night on a canal terrace, that he was tired of rooms where everyone wanted something. I'm afraid of certain things, she said. I should tell you that. Tell me. The last person who had this kind of professional authority over my life used it badly. She kept her voice even. Not violently, but badly. I left that job with less than I arrived with, and I spent 6 months rebuilding, and I am very protective of what I've built since. His expression didn't change. But something in him did. She could feel it across the table, a kind of careful, respectful anger on her behalf that he was choosing not to perform. I understand. I'm not comparing you to him. You don't have to clarify that. I'm telling you the shape of the thing I'm carrying, she said. So you know what you're asking me to trust. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Just that, nothing more, a deliberate and unambiguous gesture of steadiness, and said, Then I'll spend however long it takes proving the shape of who I am. And if that length of time is longer than I'd prefer, that's my problem, not yours. She looked down at his hand on hers. She did not move her hand away. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, don't push it. The corner of his mouth moved. Never. They had dinner. It was the best dinner she could remember. The food was extraordinary and the conversation was better, and they talked about everything except the office. Her family in Tuscany, his in Palermo, the sister he called every Sunday without fail, the grandmother he'd learned to cook from, and whose particular recipe for sugo she'd apparently stolen to the grave, and he'd never forgiven her for it, though he said this with the particular tenderness of someone who'd forgiven her completely. She told him about the architecture of small Tuscan villages and how she'd wanted to study it once, before practical considerations had steered her elsewhere. He listened like she was describing something important, because she thought he was treating it like something important. They left the restaurant near midnight. He walked her to the corner where her car was, and the city was dark and close around them. and he stood in front of her and looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention. "Next week," he said. "Not the office." "Not the office," she agreed. He touched her face, just the edge of his thumb against her cheekbone, barely there, the most restrained and most electric thing anyone had done to her in longer than she wanted to calculate. And then he stepped back, and she got in her car, and she drove home with her heart doing something enormous and improbable in her chest. They were careful. Not secret, that wasn't the right word for it. Careful. They operated in the office with the full professionalism they'd both established. And if anything, she was more rigorous about keeping her work completely beyond reproach, arriving earliest, pushing hardest, ensuring that no one looking at her output could find a single thing that looked like anything other than merit. He was the same. No preferential treatment in meetings, no adjustments to project assignments, no hint in the professional space of what existed outside it. Outside the office, it was different. Sunday dinners became Saturday walks became Tuesday evenings in his apartment, large and spare and full of books and Italian light. Where she brought work she never ended up doing because they always talked instead, for hours, the way people do when they are learning each other with the specific hunger of having waited. He cooked. That surprised her. The ease of it, the way he moved through the kitchen with the same calm authority he brought to board rooms, except warmer, less armored. He made his grandmother's pasta from memory, adjusting by instinct rather than measurement, and she sat on his kitchen counter and watched him and felt something in her chest she was beginning to stop pretending she didn't recognize. He was patient with her fear. That was the extraordinary thing. She tested it sometimes, not intentionally. She'd pull back when things felt too close, become a little cooler, a little more distant, waiting to see what he'd do with that. She'd been shaped by the previous version of this, the version where pulling back triggered retaliation or punishment, or the particular coldness of a powerful person deciding you were less than they'd hoped. Raphael did none of those things. He gave her the space she needed without making her feel like she was causing damage by needing it. He waited. He showed up the following day in exactly the same form as the day before, steady, present, unhurried. Not performing patience. Actually patient. It undid her in ways that closeness hadn't managed to. One evening, at his apartment, she was reading on his couch while he finished a call in the other room. She could hear his voice, low and precise in Italian, the professional register, and she looked up from her book and around the room and thought, I feel safe here. Not the absence of challenge. The presence of safety. The specific, rare kind that comes from trusting that the person in the next room will walk back in exactly as they left. He came back in, saw her face, and said nothing. Just sat beside her and resumed the stillness they'd developed together, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the city did its thing outside the window. I think I'm falling in love with you, she said to the middle distance. A pause. I know, he said quietly. She looked at him. You know, I've known what you are to me since a terrace above a canal. He looked at her directly, without performance or deflection. I didn't want to say it before you were ready to hear it. She held his gaze. I'm terrified. I know. That doesn't fix it. No, he agreed. But I'm not going anywhere. And I will keep being the same person tomorrow that I am right now. He paused. That's the only answer I have. It's the truest one. She kissed him then. She was the one who moved first. She would remember that always. And the room went warm and still around them, and the city outside receded to background noise. And what happened next was quiet and private and complete, the way the best things are, earned rather than taken, gentle rather than urgent, full of the specific gravity of two people who have decided to trust each other with the parts they'd been keeping safe. Later, in the dark, she lay beside him and felt something she hadn't felt in so long it almost alarmed her. Peace. Simple, uncomplicated peace, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. She slept without dreaming. The crisis arrived 6 weeks later, from a direction she hadn't watched. His name was Luca Ferrara. She'd heard it in passing. A business rival, someone who'd been in conflict with the Santini Group over a Milanese development contract that had ultimately gone against him. She'd filed it away as background noise, the usual friction of a company operating at Raphael's level. She hadn't understood the depth of it. The first sign was an envelope left on her desk, no sender, her name on the front in typed text. Inside was a photograph. Her and Raphael. Outside the restaurant in Brera, the night of their first dinner. His hand on her face. Below it, a single typed line. Does the board know their CEO is conducting personal business with his employees? She stared at it for a long, cold moment. Then she called Raphael. He arrived at her office within 3 minutes, which told her he'd been moving before she'd finished the call. He looked at the photograph, and the only sign of what he felt was a single second of stillness before his expression closed back into the controlled, analytical calm that she'd once mistaken for indifference. "Ferrara," he said. "Who is he? I mean fully, not the contract dispute." A pause. He looked at her, and she felt the specific quality of information being withheld, not maliciously but protectively, which was its own problem. "Tell me," she said. He sat down, and he told her. Luca Ferrara was not simply a business rival. He was someone Raphael had blocked from a series of increasingly aggressive property acquisitions over the past 4 years. Properties that Santini Group had outbid, outmaneuvered, or simply prevented through their own positioning in the market. Ferrara's losses had been significant. His anger had been apparently patient. "He's been building toward something," Raphael said. "My lawyers have been tracking movement for the last 2 months. This," he gestured at the photograph, "is him finding a new angle. He's going to use me," she said. "Not a question. He's going to try." She looked at the photograph on her desk. "Is this a danger? Beyond my career, is this physical danger?" He held her gaze. "I don't believe so. Ferrara operates in the spaces between legal and illegal. He prefers pressure to violence. But I've put additional security on you as of this morning." She blinked. "As of this morning? You knew before I got the envelope?" "I received intelligence from my security team yesterday that Ferrara had begun surveillance. I was going to tell you tonight." His voice was level, but she heard the thing beneath it, the place where control met something rawer. "I was trying to have the situation contained before bringing it to you. That was not your decision to make." "I know." He didn't argue it. "I was wrong." She stood up from her desk and walked to the window. Milan spread below her in its beautiful, indifferent way. She thought about the months before this job, the rebuild, everything she'd assembled. She thought about the photograph. She thought about a man who had apparently begun watching her before she'd even noticed. "How bad can this get?" she asked. "His best outcome is a board intervention based on perceived conflict of interest. The board would likely require one of us to exit the situation, professionally." He paused. "He may also attempt to leak the photograph to press contacts. And the worst outcome? A silence that lasted 2 beats longer than she wanted. He has connections to people who prefer more direct methods of persuasion. My security team believes that risk is low. I am treating it as non-negligible." She turned from the window. "You're afraid for me." He looked at her across the office, and the professional armor was entirely gone. All the controlled composure stripped back to something simpler and more fundamental. "Yes," he said. "Don't make decisions for me based on that," she said. "I need you to promise me that. Whatever comes next, I'm part of it. I'm not something to be managed." "You are not something to be managed," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, certain, like he was reading a fact from a document, settled something in her chest. "You never have been." "Okay." She picked up the envelope. "Then we deal with this together." "Together," he agreed. The following days were the most professionally difficult of her career, and in a different way, the most clarifying. Ferrara moved faster than they'd expected. By Wednesday, a version of the photograph was in the hands of 2 financial journalists. By Thursday morning, 2 board members had contacted Raphael's office requesting a conversation. By Thursday afternoon, the story was threading its way through Milan's business circles with the particular velocity of information that people already wanted to believe. She sat in meetings and answered questions and kept her composure absolutely intact. She submitted documentation to the board review process that demonstrated, clearly and completely, the independence and merit of every professional decision she'd been involved in. She was exhaustive and accurate, and she let the work speak, because that was what she knew how to do. What she didn't know how to do was watch Raphael navigate the external pressure of it, the board calls, the legal maneuvering, the media inquiries, and feel her own fear that this would be the thing that broke it, not because of Ferrara or the board, but because she'd been here before. In the blast radius of a powerful man's professional problems, and made the mistake of thinking she'd escape intact. She pulled back slightly. She couldn't help it. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Friday evening, he arrived at her apartment without calling, which he'd never done before. She opened the door and he was standing in the corridor in a dark coat, the weak visible on his face in a way he never usually allowed, and she stepped back to let him in. He walked into her apartment and looked around at it, the books and the plants and the small Tuscan photograph on the shelf from home. And then he turned and looked at her. "You're pulling away," he said. "I'm being careful." "There's a difference between careful and gone," he said. "You're moving toward gone." She sat on the couch. He sat across from her in the chair, and the apartment felt very small and very honest. "I'm scared," she said. "I know. Not of Ferrara. Of this." She pressed a hand to her own sternum. "Of having built something and watching it dismantle. I've been in this position before. The person with the power got to walk away intact, and I was the one who got to start from nothing." She looked at him. "I don't want to be in that position again." He was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the kind of directness that she'd come to understand was his version of opening completely. "I've spoken to the board," he said. "Privately. Before the review process concluded." She waited. "I told them that whatever outcome the board process determines regarding professional structure, I will not be using that process as a reason to end this." A pause. "If the board determines that one of us needs to exit a reporting relationship to satisfy governance concerns, I have proposed a restructuring that removes the direct reporting line. You would report to a separate executive committee rather than to me directly. Same role. Same scope. No reduction in responsibility or compensation." She stared at him. "You went to the board before the review concluded?" "I went to the board because I wanted them to understand that this is not a situation I intend to minimize or deny or sacrifice to protect optics." His voice was very quiet. "And I wanted you to know that the way I've handled this is not the way of the person you're afraid I'll become." She felt something happen behind her eyes. The precursor to tears she was absolutely not going to allow in this conversation. She breathed through it. "And Ferrara?" she asked. "My legal team filed this afternoon. There are several years of aggressive and, in some cases, legally questionable competitive practices documented against his firm. He has more to lose in public exposure than I do." A pause. "He'll withdraw. By Monday, I expect." She looked at him. "You've been managing this all week." "Yes." "And you're here on a Friday night." "Yes." "Because." He looked at her with those dark, still eyes, and the honesty in them was not elegant or composed. It was the simple foundational honesty of a person who has reached the place beyond strategy. "Because I wanted to be where you are," he said. "Because this week was the hardest week I've had in years, and the only place I wanted to be at the end of it was in whatever room you were in." A beat. "Because I love you. And I've loved you since a canal in the middle of the night when you told me you were trying to be a version of yourself that wasn't afraid, and I thought, so am I." The room was very quiet. She got up from the couch and crossed to him and knelt in front of his chair and took his face in her hands. This powerful, careful, obsessive, patient man who had built an empire and stood in her apartment corridor looking worn to the bone. And she looked at him very directly. "Don't ever make decisions for me without me again," she said. "Never again. And don't manage me." "I won't. And don't love me from a distance when you can love me from here." He reached up and covered her hands with his. "Here," he said, and his voice had something in it she'd never heard before, something uncalculated and wide open. "Always here." She kissed him, and he held her like she was the thing he'd been navigating every other thing toward, and outside Milan continued in its beautiful, unknowing way. And inside her apartment there was just the two of them and the Friday night and the feeling of something clicking, finally, into the place it had always been meant to occupy. Ferrara withdrew by Sunday. The formal statement from his legal team cited a desire to resolve disputes through mediation rather than public channels, which was the diplomatic language of a man who had been shown exactly how exposed his position was and had chosen retreat. Raphael's team confirmed it in a brief, neutral email that contained nothing personal and everything necessary. The board review concluded the following week. The restructuring Raphael had proposed was accepted. Ariana would report to the executive committee rather than to him directly. Her role was expanded slightly in scope, a recognition, the board's letter noted, of her demonstrated value to the organization over the preceding months. She read that line twice. She knocked on his office door that afternoon. He looked up from his desk. "The board letter," she said. "I saw it. Scope expansion was your suggestion." "The scope expansion was the board's recognition of your work," he said. "I suggested the structure. They made the determination." She looked at him across the expanse of his office. "You protected my career and your company simultaneously." "I protected you," he said simply. "The company was second." She stood in the doorway of his office and felt the full weight of what the past weeks had been, the fear and the distance and the working backward toward each other through all of it. And she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the absence of difficulty. The presence of someone who stays. Come to dinner tonight, she said. My apartment. I'll cook. He considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. What are you making? My mother's osso buco. It'll take 3 hours and it'll be worth it. I'll be there at 6. He was there at 5:50. The months that followed were the quietest happiness Ariana had ever experienced, which was unexpected. She'd always associated happiness with intensity, with drama, with the pitched emotional registers of crisis and resolution. This was different. This was Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings, and the particular ease of someone who knew where you kept things in your kitchen and brought you coffee in the exact right way before you'd asked. He was still who he was, the controlled, powerful presence she'd first seen on a mezzanine. The man who moved through rooms like they'd been arranged for him. The one who made decisions with the certainty of someone who understood consequence. But she knew now what lived beneath the composure, and he knew what lived beneath hers, and they had both made a choice to be known rather than just seen. She called her mother in Tuscany on a Sunday and talked for an hour about nothing and everything and finally, near the end of the call, said, "There's someone, Mama." A pause on the line. Someone serious? She looked across her apartment to where Raphael was reading on her couch with his glasses she hadn't known he wore until 2 months in, and her heart did the thing it always did now. Very serious. She heard her mother smile. "Tell me," she told her. Not everything. Some things were hers, but enough. Her mother was quiet through most of it, in the particular way of mothers who are listening beneath the words, and at the end she said, "You sound like yourself, Ariana. The version you were before you were hurt." She thought about that for a long time after. The version before she was hurt. She'd thought about that self as something to recover, to return to. Now she understood it differently. She wasn't the same person. She was the person who'd been hurt and had rebuilt, who'd walked into a company clutching a portfolio and found, in the most improbable place, the man who'd stood on a terrace and told her he was tired of rooms where everyone wanted something. She wasn't that old self. She was better. Raphael proposed in the kitchen of his apartment on an unremarkable Tuesday evening in the middle of making dinner. Not in a restaurant. Not in a curated setting with an audience and a photographer. He turned from the stove with a ring in his hand. Simple, extraordinary, the kind of thing that looks like it was made specifically for one person. And he said, "I want you to be the person I come home to. For the rest of my life. Will you?" No monologue. No performance. Just the question and the ring and his eyes. She said, "Yes." She said it immediately, without the hesitation she might once have expected from herself, without the old fear circling the edges of the decision. Because she was standing in a kitchen that smelled of his grandmother's sugo, and there was a man in front of her who had sat with her on a terrace in the middle of the night and been honest, who had put her career before his optics, who had spent months being the same person every single day, and the answer was not a leap into the unknown. It was a return to something she'd recognized since that first night. He slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her against him and pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held her in the specific way he had. That absolute stillness, like she was the thing everything else rotated around. And she stood in it and let herself be held. "I love you," she said into his chest. "I know," he said. And then softer. "I love you. I have loved you from a canal in the middle of the night. I will love you from here." The wedding was in Tuscany in September. Small, because they both valued the people in the room over the size of the room. Her family filled one side of the courtyard of the old villa her father had borrowed from a friend. Her mother in pale yellow who cried through the entire ceremony and denied it afterward. Her younger brother who gave a toast that was inappropriately funny and exactly right. Raphael's side was his sister Eleonora, who'd flown from Palermo and immediately treated Ariana like a fact. Not an addition, but a fact as if. Her brother's choice was too obvious to require comment, and a small collection of people who'd known him long enough to know how rare this was for him. She walked out into the September light in a dress she'd found in Florence, ivory and simple, and looked across the courtyard at the man standing at the front of it. Dark suit, no tie, the same unhurried stillness he'd had on a mezzanine the first night she'd seen him, and he looked at her with everything uncovered. No composure. No armor. Just him. She walked toward him. The words they said were old and simple, and she felt each one like a current. The promise, the choosing, the clear and irreversible declaration in front of witnesses that this was real, and this was permanent, and this was chosen. When he kissed her, Eleonora cheered. Her brother said something that made the front row laugh. The September air was warm, and the olive trees around the courtyard were old and still, and the light fell across the stones the way her grandmother had always said light fell in Tuscany. Like it had come specifically for this. She was 29 years old and married to a man who had found her in a dark club and waited her out and proved himself, day by day, in the only way that actually mattered, by being the same person in every room. For months later, standing in her bathroom in the early morning before he was awake, she looked at the test in her hand and felt something move through her that she had no language for yet. It was not fear, or not only fear. It was the specific, enormous feeling of standing at the edge of a new version of your life and knowing, rather than hoping, that you are not standing there alone. She walked back into the bedroom. He was awake. He always woke early, something she'd gotten used to, the particular stillness of him in the gray morning light. And he turned when she came in, reading her face with the immediate attention he'd always given her. She held up the test. He went absolutely still. And then something happened to his face that she had never seen before and would spend the rest of her life treasuring. All of it, every layer, every habit of control and composure, simply fell away. What was underneath was so unguarded and so completely joyful that it almost didn't look like him, and it absolutely looked like him. The truest version of him. The one she'd found on a terrace. He crossed to her in 2 strides and took her face in his hands and looked at her with those dark, absolute eyes. "Ariana," he said. Just her name. Full of everything. "I know," she whispered. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth, then pulled her against him and held her in the gray morning light of the room they'd made theirs. This woman from a small Tuscan village, and this man from Palermo who had stood on a mezzanine in a dark club and decided, without knowing her yet, that she was worth walking toward. She pressed her face into his neck and thought about a night 2 years ago. The music, the low amber light, the feeling of being watched by someone who wasn't pretending not to watch. She thought about a terrace above a canal, and the honest dark and the way he'd said, "You don't have to figure out what comes next tonight." She hadn't. She'd let it unfold, terrifying and irreversible and extraordinary, into this. Into here. His hand in her hair. His voice when he finally spoke again, low and sure. "We're going to be all right." Not a question. A fact. The kind of fact you build a life on. Outside, Milan was waking up. The light was early and pale, and coming in at the angle it came in September and October and November, slanted and golden, the way light moves when the year is turning towards something new. Inside, they stayed exactly where they were. Still. Together. Beginning.